afternoon to you all. My name is Udesh Bowen. I'm responsible for the implementation of the NAMA project. Welcome to everybody. Thanks for your presence here. So, as you know, I suppose you're all familiar with the NAMA project. It's a project geared towards the mitigation aspect in the realm of climate change. So basically, in 2015, Mauritius has ratified the Paris Agreement. This is a part of the UNFCCC convention, and an essential vehicle for this convention is what we call the Enhanced Transparency Framework. So today and tomorrow as well, we're going to delve quite extensively on this issue. We have with us Mr. Federico Canu from the UNFDTU partnership, which is located in Denmark. They are providing technical support to the NAMA project, and also Sanju Deennapanray, who is our national consultant here in Mauritius. So we'll have about an hour of presentation, and then we're going to take up questions afterwards. But now I'll leave the floor to Federico.
Thank you very much, Udesh. Thank you for the introduction. Well, it's still morning here in Copenhagen. It's sunny, and we're ready to go. So welcome all of you to this training on the Enhanced Transparency Framework for the Paris Agreement and NDC tracking. As Udesh mentioned, this is one of the central components of the GEF project, Nationally Appropriate Mitigation Actions for Low Carbon Island Development Strategy in Mauritius. I'm a project officer here at the UNFDTU partnership, and we are a co-executing agency for this project. And I'm joined by Dr. Sanju Deennapanray, who will, you all probably know him already, and he will provide more context on the Mauritian context and transparency during the Q&A session at the end of the training. Just a couple of things before we move to the main content of our webinar or training. Is going to be slightly more than an hour, maybe, if we include the Q&A. And we will also record the training, and the recording will be available a couple of days after the training. So before we start diving into the contents, I would like to inform you that we comply with the European Union General Data Protection Act, also known as GDPR, which means that your personal data, like your name, email, workplace, etc., is safely processed and stored, and all of your rights pursuant to the GDPR are respected. And you also have full access to the data that is being processed about you, and at any time you can request data to be deleted or rectified. And if you want more information, you can contact the people that are shown here on this slide. This is just to introduce you to the content of this training. Today we are going to have a short introduction to the Enhanced Transparency Framework, where we will go through transparency in general and how that has changed from the UNFCCC convention over time into the Paris Agreement and the Paris Agreement requirements. We will talk a little bit about why we need transparency in general, and then we give a short overview of the modalities, procedures, and guidance that have been provided by for Article 13 of the Paris Agreement, and also talk a little bit of the timeline for implementation of these new transparency requirements. The next presentation will be about the general aspects of the biennial transparency reports, which are the new transparency reports that are required with the Paris Agreement. And with that, we'll go deeper into the requirements with national inventory reports, also known as GHG inventories, and some aspects of NDC tracking, the nationally determined contributions. Then tomorrow, we'll take the rest of the biennial transparency report requirements, where we'll look at reporting requirements for support needed and received, and we'll take a look at aspects of adaptation and the potential way of reporting this information through adaptation communications. And after that, we'll dive more into details, which are even more relevant for the work you're participating with, guided by Sanju on transparency, which is basically the tracking of NDC. So we'll look at indicators for domestic MRV purposes and look at how they can relate to the actions that Mauritius has in its NDC. So over to today's contents. we'll look at, again, the transparency, why we need transparency, overview of the requirements as stated by the modalities, procedures, and guidance, and the timeline. The enhanced transparency framework of the Paris Agreement, it brings new challenges, especially for developing countries, given by the different nature of previous commitments and the new commitments with the Paris Agreement. But MRV discussions and decisions have matured a long time before Paris, and the national communications, you might know them and you might have worked with them, they were already born in 1992. But to improve transparency and increase need for global data and information to inform decisions during COP17 in 2012, was decided that developing countries should also start submitting biennial update reports. So going from every 4 years with national communications to every 2 years. And this was to provide an update of the most recently submitted national communication and to provide additional information in relation to the mitigation actions that countries were taking or were planning to take. And also to have some information on the support needed and received by developing countries. It was also understood that developing countries will need support in order to enable biannual reporting on their side. And even though support was and is provided, a lot of the projects you have had also with BORs or biannual update reports have also been supported by UNEP or UNEP and UNDP. This effort they've not been sufficient to enable regular biannual reporting as of today by most countries. And before the Paris agreements, also developing countries didn't have mitigation obligations. And MRV had a sort of retrospective focus on tracking and reporting on actual emissions and implemented mitigation actions. With the Paris Agreement, we now have a clear global goal, the 2-degree and 1.5-degree target that you probably know. And the framework to achieve these objectives are the NDCs, where all countries have communicated what they can do in terms of mitigation to achieve this overall objective. But to know at what point we are and what we need to achieve the objective that we have put, we need to take a kind of a prospective view. It's not enough to just have a retrospective reporting. So with this prospective view, in addition to have a clear idea of our current status, we need to look into the future. In other words, we need to communicate how much we are emitting, what we can do in terms of mitigation or commitments, and continuously also track if we are fulfilling our commitments. So with the Paris agreements and the NDCs, developed countries have to report on future emissions and mitigation measures to meet these commitments. And as the name implies, the biannual transparency report, the expected frequency of reporting is now biannual for all countries, with the exception of LDCs and SIDS, that taking into account the respective capacities, they may report at their discretion. So this figure is quite complex, and I'll try to explain it. It basically illustrates the projections of global emissions under different scenarios and the resulting emission gap expected in 2030 under the different scenarios. And what it basically shows is that we are currently not on track to meet the global goal that is set by the Paris Agreement. We know that the commitments we have now are not sufficient, but the agreement also has a framework to increase ambition over time. And here, transparency will also play a central role to inform the global stocktake and also drive future assessments for the needed enhanced ambition. If you see the top black line, it illustrates the scenario if no climate policies are implemented. And if we follow the different lines or scenarios downwards, we see that where we're headed under current policy scenarios, and the scenarios outlined with the achievement of current NDC commitments. Here there is also differentiation between unconditional and conditional scenarios. So the scenarios conditional on receiving support from the international community. And the second last scenario in light blue, it shows where we should be in terms of climate action to limit global warming to 2 degrees and the 1.5-degree target. And here, as indicated by the range of graded color of the scenario that's kind of fade out from the lines, there is the level of uncertainty with the different scenarios. So luckily, there is a framework to increase ambition, and the Paris Agreement also establishes that each successive NDC submission has to present a progression beyond the previous NDC and reflect the highest possible ambition. So hopefully we'll see an increasing ambition of NDCs over time. But to be able to more accurately define our future and the implication of our current action, we need to know where we are and where we currently are heading and what we need to do to get to where we want. And that's actually why transparency is very important at the international level. It is essential for effective planning into the future. So in accordance with Article 13, which is the one that describes transparency, and it's paragraph 5, the purpose of the framework for transparency of action is to provide a clear understanding of climate change action in the light of the 2 and 1.5 degree targets, including the clarity on tracking of progress towards achieving the NDCs under Article 4 of the Paris Agreement. The 2 key elements of information crucial that is needed to evaluate the progress and making the necessary course of corrections are the national GHG emission inventories. These provide an overview of the current status of emissions of a given country. And number 2 is the projected emissions as communicated through the NDCs and emission reductions. So the framework for transparency will therefore enable the assessment of the adequacy of efforts and guide a discussion for the potential for taking corrective steps as needed to meet the global objective. The Paris Agreement also has an adaptation goal in its Article 7 to enhance the adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and also reducing vulnerability to climate change, with a view to contribute to sustainable development and ensuring an adequate adaptation response in the context of the expected temperature increase of 2 or 1.5 degrees. So in this way, transparency framework also aims to provide clarity on parties' adaptation actions under Article 7 and their adequacy. So all this information on tracking, mitigation, and adaptation, including good practices, priorities, needs, and gaps that countries will report, will be used to inform the global stocktake. Basically what it does is that it periodically takes stock of the implementation of the Paris Agreement at the global level to assess the collective progress towards achieving the Paris Agreement long-term goals. Also, Article 13 in its paragraph 6, it has a framework for transparency of support, which is meant to provide clarity on support provided and received by relevant individual parties, and to the extent possible to provide a full overview of aggregate financial support provided to inform the global stocktake as well. And this was for the international level. At the national level, we actually see that countries have a lot to gain for increased transparency. It brings forward a wide range of different benefits. Transparency, or you can also call it monitoring and evaluation, MRV, it has different names, but in its base, it's the same. It's basically national policy efforts that are monitored and evaluated, and is usually used as an integral management tool for planning and implementation by governments at different levels, but also it's also used by corporations or organizations. Basically, having information available on emission levels and information related to climate change impacts and adaptations allows a country to prioritize mitigation and adaptation efforts aligned with its own national development priorities. And it also allows to make targeted interventions for adapting to the expected adverse impacts of climate change. It allows designing nationally appropriate mitigation and adaptation policies and measures, and thus transparency is a powerful tool to ensure that resources are allocated to ensure the highest impact possible. Transparency also provides an evidence-based approach to identify and document the effectiveness of implementation of the selected mitigation and adaptation policies and measures. And by providing this information, it also provides necessary feedback to potentially modify the interventions if needed. It is also essential to allow policymakers to make informed decisions at all stages of a policy and measures design and also in its implementation. It provides also the necessary information or data to guide strategic planning, to design and implement programs and projects, and to reallocate resources, and also provides the arguments to strategically channel public finance. So with this sound data on the measures' effectiveness and impacts as well, the perceived risks of investing in given activities due to lack of information is removed, and it becomes easier to attract private investments as well. So it has this aspect that we also need to consider. It provides the data needed to also secure finance. And lastly, but not least, it is also used to communicate support needed and received, which also can attract support from the international community. And it also allows decision makers to inform the public with real data and information about the results and the beneficiaries of the given policies and measures. So it provides also a powerful tool during and after implementation to gather public support for continued and enhanced action. So with the new modalities, procedures, and guidance that we have on the enhanced transparency framework, it's not only to look at them as new additional requirements, but also as an opportunity for developing countries to achieve all these benefits. So here I'll go quickly through the articles themselves of the paragraph themselves of the Article 13 of the Paris Agreement. It has in total of 15 paragraphs, and this is a short condensed selection which is related to what we'll talk about later on the biannual transparency report. So paragraph 1, it basically establishes the enhanced transparency framework, and its aim is to build mutual trust and confidence amongst countries and to promote effective implementation. So not only do we need to report on climate action, but also acknowledging the need for developing countries to receive support. So the enhanced transparency framework also establishes a framework for transparency on support provided and received. Paragraph 2 introduces the term flexibility in the implementation to those developing countries that need it in the light of their capacity. So is an acknowledgement that countries have different capacities. There are different stages of enhancing their capacities. So it actually provides some flexibilities to developing countries. Paragraph 3, it recognizes the special circumstances of LDCs and SIDS, and also outlines that the enhanced transparency framework should be facilitative, non-intrusive, non-punitive, and respectful of national sovereignty. And also should avoid placing undue burden on parties. Lastly, paragraph 13, it requests the adoption of common modalities, procedures, and guidelines for the transparency of action and support. And this is what describes the new reporting requirements that will be integrated in the new biannual transparency reports. So from now on, I'll call the modalities, procedures, and guidelines for MPGs for short to save time, and the enhanced transparency framework I will call the ETF to make it more quickly and smoother. So the MPGs that were agreed upon during COP24 in Katowice provide substantially more details on the substance, timing, and process of the entire ETF. The first new aspect that kind of catches the eye when you look at the MPGs is the fact that there is not any more distinction between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries. All countries are now in principle guided by the same MPGs, with, as mentioned, flexibility to be self-determined by each country. And in cases of the application of flexibility, the country will have to explain in which area and why it has applied the flexibility provision. And that's also concisely clarify the capacity constraints that don't allow them to comply with the regional requirements. So there is flexibility, but countries should also describe why the flexibility is needed. And the country must also report and follow up on the areas of improvement identified. So there is an expectation that the flexibility requirement will be used less over time as capacity is built. So now we look at the structure itself of the MPGs. It's divided in different chapters, and it provides different guidance for the information to be included. So we have the first chapter, introduction, which basically introduces the purpose, principles, and other clarifications of flexibility, which I already mentioned. Chapter 2 is about the national inventory report or the greenhouse gas inventory. Chapter 3 is about the information necessary to track progress made in implementing and achieving NDCs. And this is quite new for most developing countries. Chapter 4 is the information related to climate change impacts and adaptation. Chapter 5 is the information on financial, technology development and transfer and capacity building support provided and mobilized. Chapter 6 is about information on financial, technology development and transfer capacity building support needed and received. So chapter 5 is directed towards developed countries, which are expected to provide finance, and chapter 6 is directed towards developing countries, which are expected to receive finance. Then chapter 7 is about the technical expert review, which is basically technical experts that review these reports that countries submit. Chapter 8 describes the process of the facilitative multilateral consideration of progress, where the progress of implementation is discussed amongst countries. And we will here focus on the aspects of implication of the MPGs for reporting of developing countries. So we'll not go through all the chapters. So the chapters we'll go through is chapter 2, 3, 4, and 6. So these 5 chapters that I just mentioned are the ones relevant for countries reporting requirements. We have them in this figure under the column information, which is basically information relevant for greenhouse gas inventories, information to track progress on implementing and achieving NDCs, information on climate change impacts and adaptation, information on support provided, which we'll not go through in the presentation, and information on the financing, technology, and capacity development support needed and received. So the information from chapter 2 to 5 is gathered in the biannual transparency report, the key report for the ETF. Basically, it's a reporting vehicle for the elements listed under the column information. And as you can see in the figure, some of these blocks have dashed or solid lines going into the BTR, and that reflects a differentiation between the reporting requirements. So the fixed lines are shall requirements. All countries need to report on this. And some are should requirements. So basically, this is information that we would like to see, but it's not a full-on requirement to report. One specific note that we also have here is for the support provided and mobilized, which is mandatory, but only for developed countries, as mentioned. So we don't need to look at this information. So for countries that are parties to the Paris agreements, the first BTR should be submitted at the latest by the 31st December 2024. Here with the exception for LDCs and SIDs, which may submit at their discretion. So the timing for submission is flexible, but they will still need to follow the reporting requirements outlined in the MPGs when submitting the BTR. Other key reports are the National Inventory Report and the Adaptation Communication. So the National Inventory Report is a mandatory deliverable and is also a component of the BTR, but countries can submit it as a standalone document if they want to, and that's why it's dashed. While the adaptation communication is not a mandatory submission under DTF and may be submitted with the BTR or through other reporting vehicles, such as the NDC, the National Communication, or National Adaptation Plans. But the BTR still has a should requirement for information on climate change impact and adaptation. So the BTR and the inventory reports are the key inputs for the 2 elements under the review column here, which is the technical expert review and the facilitative multilateral consideration of progress. And the MPGs also provided information on these 2 processes that you can see here in the Roman numbers in chapter 7 and 8, but we will not go into depth on this here. So starting from the figure that we just seen in the previous slide, we now take a step back and look at how the ETF and the information provided in the BTR links to the broader picture of the Paris Agreement. The central element of the figure is the red area representing Article 13 of the Paris Agreement, which establishes the enhanced transparency framework as we have just seen. Here, the green area on the left, it captures the information that countries have included or will include in their NDCs. This is required by Article 4, 6 to 11 of the Paris Agreement. This information is also linked to the information covered by Article 13, as you can see in the red area. So this is the link between the NDC and the Enhanced Transparency Framework, how the Enhanced Transparency Framework takes the information and the NDC and reports on it. So the information feeds into the different reports of the ETF identified under the reporting column here in the figure. And the BTR and the inventory reports are then inputs for the two elements under the review column, consisting of the technical expert review and the multilateral consideration of progress. The blue area on the right represents the global stocktake and compliance provisions, which is the global stocktake and the implementation and compliance mechanism. The BTR informs the global stocktake on parties' progress towards achieving the NDCs and parties' adaptation actions, and including good practices, priorities, needs, and gaps, and support provided and received, in order to assess collective progress towards achieving the objective of the Paris Agreements. The BTR also informs the Compliance Committee, which facilitates implementation and promotes compliance with the provision of the Paris Agreement. The Implementation and Compliance Committee initiates considerations of issues in case, among others, a party does not submit the BTR or participates in the facilitative multilateral consideration of progress, and also may engage in a facilitative consideration of issues. This is in cases of significant and persistent inconsistencies of the information submitted. And finally, the outcomes of the global stocktake and compliance process should become usable information for countries preparing new NDCs in a way that would theoretically lead to continuous improvement and enhanced ambition over time. This is the lines that feed back into information in the NDC here in the figure. So if we look at the timeline for implementation of the Enhanced Transparency Framework, we start with the current reporting requirements that go from 19 here in this figure up to 2020. And one of the key reports is the national communication, including the national GHG inventory, here illustrated by the dark lines or bars on the top. And it started in 1997 for developing countries, and biannual update reports came in as additional requirements following the Cancun agreements in COP16. And the Durban decisions also, I think, in COP17 in 2011. The first BURs from developing countries were to be submitted by December 2014. And with the introduction of the ETF, the key report becomes the BTR, including the national inventory report, to be submitted every 2 years, starting from the first submission, no later than 31st of December 2024. So in this period up to 2024, which we here call the preparatory phase, developing countries are required to submit national communications as well as biannual update reports. I think Mauritius has just gone through a BUR process, and all countries that have ratified the Paris Agreement will continue submitting national communications every 4 years after 2024, while the requirement for the submissions of BUR is discontinued. So the BTR becomes the new reporting requirements. Countries can also submit an adaptation communication as part of their BTR, and the BTR will undergo a technical expert review process of maximum 1 year, followed by the facilitative multilateral consideration of progress. The figure here also shows that the process for reporting and review takes place in parallel to the process of NDC submission every 5 years, with the next submission deadline coming up to 2020, which we will see now with the postponement of COP, how that will turn out in terms of this timeline might become slightly changed. The reason why in this figure we call the phase until 2024 the preparatory phase is that in this period countries have the opportunity to start familiarizing with the MPGs, and also although the MPGs outline the reporting requirements for the BTR, the topics that they cover, which includes reporting on inventories, tracking on NDCs, climate change impacts and adaptation, support received, they're also of relevance to other submissions under the convention, such as the NDC and national communications and current BURs, and inventory, and also the adaptation communication. So countries could already take into account the future requirements for the BTR outlined in the MPGs in preparing the incoming work on the current review of NDCs, and national communications, BURs, and inventories. And this basically to take advantage of this time to enhance the readiness for reporting BTRs. So in this context, we already know from the decision from COP24 that in the years where national communications and BTRs coincide, so if a country is to submit a national communication and a BTR during the same year, countries may also submit them as a single report, but will have to follow the MPGs, so the requirements for BTRs, and also includes aspects on research and systemic observation, and on education, training, and public awareness, and also one additional chapter on adaptation, which is not covered in the BTR, which is still a national communication requirement. Also, I think there is a provision that countries can submit their last BUR in conjunction with the first BTR, but also here following the new reporting requirements outlined by the MPGs. Yeah. So to summarize, one of the main aspects of the ETF lies in the new approach, where there is less of a distinction between developed and developing countries. However, the MPGs allow some flexibility for developing countries and additional discretion for LDCs and SIDS to submit their BTR when they have the capacity to do so. But when countries make the use of flexibility, they need to explain specifically why, and also they will have to provide plans and timeframes for how to meet the full requirements. The central report to be produced is the BTR, which acts as a reporting vehicle for the inventory, information to track progress on NDCs, climate change impacts and adaptation, and information on support received, and may also work as a reporting vehicle for the adaptation communication. The MPGs introduce new requirements in terms of data collection for the areas where the new information will need to be produced. Countries should make use of the preparatory phase, as I mentioned, to start gathering such data. And furthermore, as some of this information may be relevant or connected to current work streams on NDC, national communication, BURs, inventories, and adaptation communications, countries can take these interconnections into consideration when preparing these reports in order to not duplicate future efforts, and also improve comparability across reporting, and ultimately getting ready for when the ETF becomes effective. And countries might still need support to be guided in how the MPGs translate into tangible transparency activities and institutional frameworks and procedures that might have to be established. And the Paris Agreement actually acknowledges these needs and has a provision of support to developing countries. And two examples of global initiatives that can offer support for transparency are the CBIT, the Capacity Building Initiative for Transparency, which is the GEF-funded initiative, and is currently the largest global support provider for transparency, and also the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency, or ICAT, which provides support in terms of making available methodologies to assess the impacts of climate policies and actions, and also provide support for selected countries in enhancing their transparency capacities. And with that, we end our first session. I think we will take just a minute to reorganize, and we'll save the questions for after the last presentation. I just need to reorganize my presentation. I'll be right back to you. So, welcome back. So I'll dive straight to the next presentation and the reporting requirements themselves. Now I've introduced the whole broader perspective of the ETF. So here I will go through the general aspects of the BTRs and the national inventory reports and NDC tracking. And tomorrow we'll look at the support needed and received and adaptation aspects. And before we take a deep dive into the BTR, I mean, just to recap on the purpose of the framework for transparency is actually divided into two specific purposes that are mentioned in the Paris Agreement. It's to provide a clear understanding of climate change action in the light of the Paris Agreement's objective of the 2 and 1.5 degree targets, and to provide clarity on tracking progress towards achieving parties' individual NDCs, which inform the global stocktake and take stock of implementation. These are things that I mentioned, and I'm repeating them here. But it's basically these two things, is the transparency action and transparency of support. And on support is to provide clarity on support provided and received, and to provide a full overview of aggregate financial support provided to inform the global stocktake, because there is also a target of established during COP19 in Copenhagen about the 100 billion of climate finance to be provided by developed to developing countries. So we need also to track the progress provided. But since this is more of an issue for developed countries, we'll not touch upon this in this training. As mentioned, the BTR is the main reporting vehicle. And I also mentioned the timeline and the flexibility provisions, so I'll not go in depth here. And let's go directly into one of the first aspects and chapter 2 in the MPGs, which describes the national inventory report. Here, this table gathers the reporting requirement relevant for a series of information or details described in the left column to be reported in the national inventory report, which I will call NIR from now on to just make it smoother for me to pronounce. The column in the middle gathers the requirements for the NIR that is currently part of the BURs, while the column on the right refers to the NIR as part of the BTR, so the new requirements under the Paris Agreement. So this is to give you a perspective into how the requirements change from the Convention to the Paris Agreement. So as I already mentioned, the MPGs are common for all parties, and so is the guidance for national inventories, which is part of the MPGs. So in the following table, you'll see some requirements that are highlighted in blue. These are requirements for which flexibility applies. So all the text in black is shall requirements that each party have to adhere to, and the blue is the additional information that is requested, but there is a understanding that some developing countries might have a hard time providing this information at this stage, so it's only a should requirement. So regarding the reporting from under the BUR, the NIR uses to be comprised of a GHG inventory, according to the guidelines for preparation of national communications, and a reporting part consisting of a summary of the inventory. The submission requirement of the NIR has changed from a should to shall requirement, so it's now a mandatory submission for all parties submitting a BTR. And also there is a change from the IPCC guidelines that need to be used. So from the 1996 guidelines to the 2006 IPCC guidelines, which is also shall requirement. In terms of gases to be reported, we have shifted from 3 to 7 gases that shall be reported. However, for the new requirements, if flexibility is needed, countries can report at least the first 3 gases, so CO2, methane, and N2O, so nitrous oxide. Under the Paris Agreement, also countries will have to identify key categories for the starting and last year. So a key category is one that is prioritized within the national inventory system because its estimates has a significant influence on the total inventory of gases, and it includes both sources and sinks. And basically how you decide that it has a high influence is because altogether these key categories should add up to 95% of the total level of emissions. And here, if flexibility is needed for developing countries, which is also an addition to the new requirements, countries can use 85% threshold for the gases. For each category, countries should also provide individual and cumulative contributions and the level and trend for first and last reporting years. So while before the time series were not a mandatory requirement, now countries will be asked to report consistent annual time series from 1990. The latest reporting year is to be no more than 2 years prior to submission. So the data should not be more than 2 years old. And if flexibility is needed, countries can instead report data covering at a minimum the reference year or period for its NDC and a consistent annual time series from at least 2020 and onwards. So the inventory work is expected to be intensified for all countries. Basically, the difference for the rest of the requirements is that requirements change more towards a shall requirement in the new rules for the near, but still leaves some flexibilities that countries can, for example, only discuss qualitatively the uncertainty instead of quantifying the uncertainty well, in their calculations, and have a larger margin to not estimate some emissions. But countries shall still implement and maintain institutional arrangements for the estimation, compilation, and timely reporting of national inventory reports. So moving over to the content of the BTR, now that we have looked at the near, I'll start presenting one of the central and new elements of the BTR, which is the information needed to track progress and implementation of NDCs. The MPGs, if you remember from my earlier presentation, stands for modalities, procedures, and guidance. So it guides the work and the information to be reported in the BTR. So it has the information to track progress on NDC is mainly divided into 6 different chunks of information or sub-chapters, A, B, C, D, E, and F. And it's information about national circumstances, the description of the NDC, the information to track progress, then specific information on mitigation policies and measures, including adaptation actions with mitigation co-benefits, and also economic diversification plans. There's also a section on summary of emissions and removals, and also projections of emissions and removals. So starting off with the national circumstances, the MPGs require information on the national circumstances relevant for climate change and how these circumstances affect emissions and removals over time. Information is divided into main aspects, but is basically something about the government structure, population profile, geographical profile, economic profile, the climate profile, and sector details. And this information is also relevant when countries look for support, especially the climate profile that makes the case for the climate rationale for why support is needed as well. So, and although this information is not specifically requested by the convention's other reporting vehicles, like the national communications and BURs, it is also relevant information and has surely also been included in former reporting by Mauritius as well. Although with the NDC, new important aspects become relevant to report. So countries are now requested to provide information on the institutional arrangements in place to track progress made in implementing and achieving its NDC. And when describing these arrangements, they shall also provide information on the legal, institutional, and administrative and procedural arrangements for domestic implementation, monitoring, reporting, archiving of information as well, and also the stakeholder engagements related to the implementation and achievement of the NDC. So these are new requirements. And also with Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is related to market mechanisms, countries now also have the opportunity to participate in what is called cooperative approaches and basically trade exchange emission reductions. So countries participating in these cooperative approaches, they should also describe the institutional arrangements for tracking what is called internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, or ITMOs for short. And they will also have to provide an emission balance with emissions by source and removals covered by the NDC, which is also adjusted with an addition for ITMOs transferred and a subtraction for ITMOs used or acquired if they use such ITMOs. You might relate this to what CERs were under the Kyoto Protocol, but it's slightly different. Also, countries, if they use cooperative approaches, they will also have to describe how these approaches promote sustainable development and ensures environmental integrity and transparency, including in governance, and also applies robust accounting to ensure the avoidance of double counting of emission reductions. And also, if a country implements changes in institutional arrangements, these changes should also be reported in the BTR, while unchanged information can be provided as reference. So looking into the description of the NDC is basically there to provide clarity on the NDC and the parameters that are used to track the implementation, including basically the targets and a description of the targets, including what kind of target type is included in the NDC. And I don't know if you have looked at many different NDCs, but the targets can take many forms and shapes. We have economy-wide absolute emission reductions, emission intensity reductions related to GDP. We have emission reductions below projected baselines or business as usual scenarios. We have a description of mitigation co-benefits of adaptation actions and economic diversification plans. We have a list of policies and measures and other ways to express targets. So it's important to provide a description of the target in order to create an understanding of the target. And the target description also needs to specify the target years or periods and whether there are single or multi-year targets. The reference points, which is the levels, baselines, the base years or starting point, and the respective values, the time frame or periods for implementation, then the scope and coverage, including basically sectors, categories, activities, sources and sinks, pools and gases. And this section should also provide information on any intention to use cooperative approaches and ITMOs. And also updates or clarifications if needed of previously reported information, like if there is recalculation of previously reported information with when new and better data is available, or also greater detail on the use of methodologies or the use of cooperative approaches. So now that the NDC is described, countries need to provide needed information to track the progress and achievements. And basically, this is about reporting how we are performing. And for that, we need NDC targets and indicators. And these indicators are the core of the NDC description and tracking. And different types of targets and indicators can be used on the basis of the NDC target types. And as I mentioned, this can be divided in the following, like absolute emission reductions, which is a target that is kind of easily translatable into an indicator, like net emissions and removals. This is usually expressed in national emission targets for a future year, like net emission reduction by 2025 or 2030, and needs to be expressed in relation to a base year, like some countries use 1990, other 2005, or others. And for targets involving emission intensity reductions, the target is expressed as a national GHG intensity, which is the GHG emissions per unit of GDP or per capita or other. And this could be translated into an indicator of percentage of reduction of GHG emission per unit of GDP. That the last presentation tomorrow will dive deeper into more specific indicators as well. Then we have targets which are emissions reductions below a baseline, which is basically net emission reductions and removals as the absolute targets, but compared to a projected national emission by 2025 or 2030, for example. And for that, we need to make projections of expected increasing emissions over time. And then we have some targets which relate to strategies, plans, and actions, and are expressed usually as a specific strategy, policy, and actions. And here the target is to adopt these policies and actions. And they do not have necessarily a specific GHG emission reduction goal. And if these strategies don't have a quantified emission reduction specified, they will need to provide relevant qualitative indicators like share of renewable energy, sectoral energy efficiency improvements, for instance, or average efficiency of road vehicles, it could be. Although countries are encouraged to move towards economy-wide emission reduction targets over time, also this would simplify the process of the global stocktake, as it would make the targets way more similar and thus more easy to put into context and to compare and aggregate. And lastly, targets involving mitigation, co-benefits, and adaptation actions or economic diversification plans. They can also have a variety of indicators. Economic diversification plan in the context of climate change, if you don't know, it basically refers to two concepts. Strategies aimed at increasing economic resilience by shifting away from vulnerable products, markets, and jobs towards low emission and climate resilient income sources. Could be a country highly reliant on the oil sector, or measures aimed at reducing the adverse impact of implementation of climate change mitigation policies that have cross-border effect. This is especially relevant for countries with countries which have economies concentrated on few products, services, or sectors, and those which have this basically that rely on these and have and are expected to experience like a drop in consumption as a result of mitigation measures in other countries. Again, the oil sector, if the world consumes less oil, these countries which are reliant on oil exports will be impacted economically. So adapting to that is also, in many ways, can also lead to mitigation. And examples of indicators, it could be also hectares of reforestation, percentage of renewable energy used in production, carbon neutrality, or share of non-fossil fuel in primary energy consumption. So in addition to the target and indicator values, countries shall also describe each methodology and or accounting approach used to define the targets, how they constructed baseline, and each indicators, including key parameters, assumptions, definitions, data sources, models used, which IPCC guidance has been used, and also which metrics have been used. So a lot of information is not only enough to provide the simple data, but also a description of how this information has been produced. And the information on the methodologies applied is also requested for countries whose countries include the implementation of policies and measures, and also for the use of ITMOs. Also, countries will also have to explain how the methodology in each reporting year is consistent with the methodology used when communicating the NDC. So it's basically ensuring that the NDC and BTR are aligned and the same methodology is used to make the NDC projections and to do the tracking. and also explain any methodological inconsistencies if there are with the most recent NEAR, and how double counting of emission has been avoided. Then all the information requested above should also, all this information should also be provided in a structured summary, including contribution from the land use change and forestry sector for each year of the target period. And the summary is to be provided in a narrative and tabular format. We will know the format exactly of this summary. It was expected to be provided in November 2020 after COP26. We will see how that will turn out now. As part of this summary, countries using ITMOs also required to provide annual emissions by sources and removals covered by the NDC, but also a balance with including the transferred ITMOs. So between this slide and the previous, you can see that the information requested on NDC tracking is quite extensive, but this is also one of the central parts of the MPGs and one of the important elements of transparency for the Paris Agreement. So it was to be expected that it was so comprehensive. So many NDCs have included policies and measures as part of the mitigation contribution. And information on these policies and measures is also requested in order to track NDC progress. And there is a wide range of details of what need to be reported. So the countries are requested to provide information on actions, policies, and measures that support the implementation and achievement of the NDC, including the estimates of expected and achieved emission reductions, and also their methodologies and assumptions used in estimating the reductions. And these policies, measures, actions, and plans, which also include adaptation actions and economic diversification plans, they should also be reported upon. This information is actually already reported in national communications and BURs, although not with the same level of requested detailed information. Like an example is the type of implementation instruments used, GHG estimations and costs, and basically might point that policies and measures included in the NDCs are expected to be concrete and tangible measures with ready implementation instruments, and should basically allow for an ex ante estimation of impacts, so before implementation. And parties must also include descriptive information of these policies and measures, and may also provide information on non-GHG mitigation benefits, which is not a shall requirement. Flexibility in this specific area of information is allowed for countries with limited capacity, and it's also suggested that countries that currently work on or plan to produce a new or revised NDC, national communication of BUR, should really consider to gradually enhance or align the reporting requirements with the BTR requirements to prepare for the first BTR. So the summary of GHG emissions and removals is basically a reporting element, as I mentioned, and it's currently under negotiation, and the proposed format will be known by the end of 2020, possibly. And it's mostly relevant for countries that submit inventory as a standalone report to the BTR, actually. So if the inventory is a part of the BTR, all the information will be in the inventory report inside the BTR. The last section on the information to track progress on the NDCs is on projections on emissions and removals, which oddly enough will only be indicative and not be used by the reviewing arrangement of the UNFCCC to assess NDC progress and achievements, and it's not mandatory for developing countries. So here basically parties are required to provide projections of greenhouse gas emissions and removals, although developing countries that need flexibility are only encouraged to provide them, and also allowed to limit projections until the end point of their NDC and to provide less detail on methodologies and coverage. But in principle, projections are to extend at least 15 years beyond the next year ending in 0 or 5, meaning that if the most recent NEAR is, for example, the one presenting values from 2024, the projections in the BTR shall reach 16 years into 2040. While for a year with values from 2026, the projections shall reach 19 years, so into 2045. The scenarios will have to include a with measures scenario of all GHG emissions and removals, and will also include with additional measures or a without measure scenario. So what would happen without any measures? What would happen with planned or already in the planning or in implementation measures? And what would happen with additional measures implemented with support? The projection of GHG emissions and removals will provide basically quantitative information of the impact of mitigation policies and measures. And the with measure scenario requires a projection of all emissions and removals, including currently implemented and adopted policies and measures. The scenarios that are optional and may be reported, the additional measures and the without measures. Basically, with additional measures, the projection including implemented, adopted, and planned policies and measures, and without measures with excluding all the policies and measures. And the projection have to be presented in a graphical and tabular format and provided with and without land use change, and forestry. It include projections by sector and by gas, as well as cumulative at the national level, using common metrics as used in the GHG inventory. And in addition, projections of key indicators to determine progress towards the NDCs need to be provided. And countries also should include a description of the methodologies used to develop the projections, including models, approaches, and key underlying assumptions and parameters. And basically, in short, projections should be made in the similar classification as for the inventory. This is an example of a table from one inventory. And basically looking back at historical emissions in this table, while projections will have to show the same basically emissions projected into the future, and with the additional option to include with additional and or without measures. So tomorrow we will continue on the BTR requirements. This was it from my part today. Tomorrow we'll look at the BTR requirements on aspects of adaptation and support. But now I'll give the word over to Sanju. Let's see also if there are any incoming questions. But the word over to you, Sanju, first.
Hi, everybody. This is Sanju speaking here. Thank you, Federico, for this introduction to Article 13 of the Paris Agreement. Regarding the enhanced transparency framework. I think at this stage, what I will do is rather than actually adding to what you have said, we better leave, since we've actually started a bit later, we actually take questions and give more time to participants to actually put their questions to us.
Okay, I can see we have two questions in already. See, one question is basically how different is the BUR to the BTR? I think I tried to explain this in one of my tables that shows some of the previous to the current reporting requirements. I mean, you can see it here for the national inventory report or the greenhouse gas inventory. There is some difference, but the main difference is basically that some requirements for developing countries become mandatory, so from non-mandatory to mandatory. The main difference is also the change of IPCC guidelines from 1996 to 2006. The reporting of gases, there should be actually 7 gases reported now. If countries need flexibility, they can describe why they need it. There is requirements on what the percentage of the gases covered to identify the key categories, also with some flexibility here. But overall, between the BUR and the BTR, I would say the big difference is the level of reporting requirements and the aspect of the NDC that was not a part of the BUR. Now all countries have forward-looking targets. So the reporting on the NDC progress and achievements, I would say, it's the biggest change. BURs requested to report on mitigation actions and NAMAs, but here there is an expectation that, I mean, all countries have NDCs and all countries will have to report on those, and the amount of information requested on the NDC reporting is way more detailed than the BUR requested information of mitigation actions and policies.
If I can just add something quickly, Federico. If you look at the current level of reporting that we do in Mauritius, right, just to contextualize it a little bit more, basically, if we include the level of flexibility that is allowed, okay, under the agreement, Paris Agreement, regarding the transfer framework, there won't be significant changes for us, at least from the perspective of the inventory, okay? So, and that is, I think, it's very reassuring for us, okay? And just to remind everybody on the call today that as a SIDS, we get more derogation, you know, in addition to the flexibility mechanisms under the Paris Agreement, because all countries, you know, in not confounding developing, develop, Annex 1, non-Annex 1, will have to actually submit the first BTR by the 30th of December 2024. And NDCs are exempt from that particular deadline. Okay, so I think pretty much we are in a pretty good shape, you know, as from where we are starting already. Okay, as for example, we already apply the IPCC guidelines of 2006. We do the three main gases, and for a lot of the others, you know, because the structure of the economy is such that we either don't emit them or we don't use them, so we don't have to. You know, it wouldn't be very difficult to actually make a case for that. And, you know, we don't actually report, you know, there is nothing that is excluded, but we constitute more than 50% of the total national inventory gases, okay? So the main thing would be on the part of the NDC mitigation contributions that we will have to focus on.
Thank you, Sanju, for providing the context of the situation in Mauritius. I also know that Mauritius has been receiving support for transparency or providing their communication, and is also, I think, applying for support from the Capacity Building Initiative for Transparency from the GEF to enhance its capacities on transparency related to the Paris Agreement. So you will also receive support in the future that can be used to prepare for the new reporting requirements. So I would expect that some of the focus might go into inventory work, but also a lot of it will probably go on NDC tracking. I see there are other questions coming in, and one is, does the 2006 IPCC software account for all gases? And the answer is yes. The software is basically pre-made to be able to report on all the required gases. And then why does the IPCC guidelines differ from NEAR and BTR? Are we able to compare emissions between these reports? So the IPCC guidelines changing from 1996 to 2006 are not necessarily between the NEAR and BTR. The national inventory reports have been submitted with national communications, with BURs, and now with BTRs. What has changed in and will be continued to be reported, ideally every 2 years. What has changed with the guidelines is slightly the definition of sectors. There are updates on, I mean, and the IPCC has made updates and refinements throughout its lifetime on the guidelines, and this is basically because research allows for better information to come in, which might lead to a change in which global warming potential do we want to apply to gases. How do we account emissions from different activity data in the different sectors? So it's basically provides updates on the latest research and makes the inventories more precise. There's still, I mean, countries will still be able to compare their reports. So what I would say is that the new reports applying the new guidelines will probably just hopefully be more aligned with reality. I don't know if you have anything to add, Sanju.
Yeah, I mean, just to know from just a purely carbon accounting perspective, normally you will have to see when you change methodology to keep up with the latest science. Like Federico mentioned, you can have emission factors that change, or you can have the calculation methodology, the maths that you use to do the accounting changes, and also the global warming potential that now have to be aligned with the AR5 GWPs, right? But then again, if you see that when you change methodology and the change is more than 5% a deviation between what you get with the methodology compared to what you had with the old methodology, then typically a country would have to restate the entire historical record so that you have a whole historical data set that is consistent in terms of methodology. And this is something that we have done in Mauritius already with the 2006 guidelines that we use. If you look at the financial communication and even the BER, they're all aligned with the 2006 guidelines.
Thank you for providing this very important detail, Sanju. We have a new question, and basically what happens if you don't have detailed activity data prior to 2000? And there is an acknowledgement of, especially, not only, but especially for developing countries, for the challenges in having both historical data, precise data. So it's not, I mean, as I mentioned, maybe I didn't stress it, the MPGs are supposed to be non-intrusive, non-punitive. So basically, countries are expected to report on what they can. So if there is no activity data prior to 2000, then this will just have to be described in the reporting. And with the new requirements, with the expectation of gradual improvements over time, countries will probably be expected to write what the country will do to enable that this data will be collected in the future. And another question, can we know more about adaptation communications, since this is new to me? I will present on the adaptation communication tomorrow. This will be during our first presentation tomorrow. Because of time restrictions, I needed to split the part of the presentation in two, but we'll look at adaptation aspects and support needed tomorrow. I don't know if there are more questions. If not, I don't know if you have anything to add, Sanju?
Yeah, Federico, maybe at this juncture, just for clarity, let's I'll just make a little summary, right, in terms of how we situate the whole ETF in the context of Mauritius, right, in terms of support we're receiving. So for the ETF, in terms of reporting requirement, we're going to be having to report on inventory, the national inventory. Then for the NDC part, we will have to do both the mitigation actions that we propose in the NDC and also the adaptation part, right? So just for clarity, for those who don't know that already, there is the NAMA project that will actually look at developing mitigation scenarios from 2020 plus 15 years. That's the minimum requirement. If you look at the timeline for projections. So that is going to support the updating of our NDC that we were supposed to do by COP26, but with a delay, we'll see how that pans out, probably early next year. And the NAMA project under which this webinar is being held will deal mainly with mitigation actions related to the NDC, and the ETF related to that part. And then tomorrow, probably, we're going to be talking more about that in the second part of Federico's presentation. Now, for the inventory part, Mauritius will get technical assistance under the GEF project, the CBIT, right? So the NAMA project that we are going to be interacting on for the next couple of months, or have been for the last couple of months, will not deal with the issue of inventory. Then tomorrow, Federico will talk a little bit about the adaptation part, But just know that neither the CBIT nor the NAMA project, which are both mitigation projects, will deal with the adaptation part. And maybe colleagues from the Ministry of Environment can talk about that, but that will have to happen maybe within the ambit of developing the NAP for Mauritius with support from the GCF or other multilateral sources. So this is just a clarification I wanted to bring to situate a little bit the different responsibility of initiatives and projects in relation to supporting Mauritius to put in place the ETF.
Thank you, Sanju. I just saw that I received one last question. It's a very detailed question, which is what global warming potential must be applied for the NEAR in the BTR. So the global warming potential that needs to be used according to 2006 guidelines. You might want to correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't always remember the difference between the different AR reports, but I believe, I mean, CO2 is still one, because that's what we measure against. So when we look at the other gases, looking at methane and nitrous oxide, we look at CO2 equivalents. And I believe the methane changed from 24 to 28 CO2 equivalents, and nitrous oxide, I believe, is 298 or 265. I'm not sure. I don't know if you have other numbers. 298. But yes, if you have other more specific questions, you can always send an email to me or Sanju. You can find our emails here in the front slide, and I'll be happy to respond.
But typically, when you download the IPCC tool, and everybody can download that, you know, it's customized already, right? I mean, it's aligned already with the AR5.
Yes, yes. I don't see any other questions. From my side, I will thank you all for listening in, and it's a slightly longer webinar than we usually do. I've been enjoying it. I've been enjoying having you here. I don't know if you have any closing remarks, Udesh.
I wish to thank you and Sanju for your inputs and all the participants as well. And so hope to see you all carry on with it tomorrow at the same time. Thank you.